This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Madame Veto avait promis, Madame Veto avait promis de faire égorger tout Paris, de faire égorger tout Paris.
Hello, my name is Tim Lynch. I'm the convener of 10 Great Books, a Melbourne Masterclass. You're very welcome to our next instalment, delivered via Zoom, a medium we hope we've mastered, but one we hope to leave as soon as lockdown makes that feasible. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm filming from this morning, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Our live Q&A will take place in the usual Great Book slot at 6:30 on June the 16th, Tuesday, June the 16th. And I'd encourage you to store up your questions, your comments, your reactions to the text and offer them to our speaker in that session. It's my great delight to welcome Professor Peter McPhee again to the 10 Great Books series. Peter was educated at the University of Melbourne, where he completed his PhD. He's taught at La Trobe University and the Victoria University of Wellington before coming back to Melbourne, where he's held a personal chair in history since 1993. He continues to teach undergraduates. He's published many books about modern France, most of which you will be aware of and have read. Most recently, Robespierre, A Revolutionary Life, and The Brilliant Liberty or Death, The French Revolution, published in 2016. As chair of the university's Curriculum Commission in 2006, Peter oversaw the far-reaching curriculum reform, which has become part of our everyday discourse here on the campus, known as the Melbourne Model, which involved rethinking the university's curriculum from first principles. He was appointed the university's first provost in 2007. Professor McPhee was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2012. He will be supported today by Maxine McHugh. She's Honorary Enterprise Professor based in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Peter McPhee has offered a text in nearly every series that we've delivered. Indeed, he offered our first great book all those years ago in 2014 on Rousseau's Emile. It is my great pleasure to welcome Peter and his offering of our 65th great book. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. A Tale of Two Cities is a famous book, often referred to as one of the best-selling books of all time. On one level, it is a profoundly moving story of personal redemption, of good and evil, of emotional loyalties and hatreds, played out against the menacing background of the injustices of 18th century England and France, and the violent conflicts of the French Revolution. On another level, it is also redolent of Dickens' celebrated capacity as a writer of gripping, episodic prose, and of his values and principles, perhaps also of his private life. My approach to it is essentially that of an historian, placing Dickens within the context of his own life and times in the late 1850s, and considering his evocation of the Great French Revolution 70 years earlier. In this context, it is a profoundly controversial novel. I'll be assisted, as Tim said, by readings from the text by our friend Maxine McHugh, who gave this year's series its wonderful opening with her session on Philip Roth's American Pastoral. There's no more famous opening to a novel than Dickens' first sentences. Maxine.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only.
Charles Dickens was born in 1812 in the modest red brick house on the left in Portsmouth, one of 8 children who grew up in genteel poverty with an improvident father, a clerk in the Navy Pay Office. When Charles was just 12, his father was sent to this debtor's prison in London, and Charles was sent to work part-time, packing and putting labels on tins of shoe polish for 10 or 12 hours a day. So Charles not only saw but experienced at first hand the hard times which were faced by most of the population in the early Victorian era. But he was also a precocious and brilliant student with a remarkable talent for prose. He left school at 15 and became a freelance reporter. This is our first portrait of him by an aunt. After the 1836 publication of the Pickwick Papers, his life changed completely, including marriage to Catherine Hogarth that year. By the 1840s, he was an energetic, eagerly crusading, mercurial and good-humoured, if sometimes angry, young man. Within 5 years, the couple had had 5 children, and he had published Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, and A Christmas Carol. His celebrity had become international, and in 1842 he made a successful, lucrative trip to the United States with Catherine, leaving the children in London with her sister Georgina. Shortly after his return, Margaret Gillies made this portrait of him, only rediscovered 2 years ago in South Africa. His productivity was astonishing, dashing off literary sensations in his distinctive handwriting. By the late 1850s, with further smash successes with Bleak House, Hard Times and Little Dorrit, Dickens had become the greatest celebrity of his age. In just 10 months, in 1858-59, he gave no fewer than 129 public readings in 49 towns across Britain. It's difficult for us to imagine the enthusiasm for literary performance at these sold-out events. There's today no equivalent of his popularity outside perhaps Cristiano Ronaldo or Taylor Swift, but unlike them, he appealed across lines of class and age. So what's the essential storyline of the book? The action unfurls across the 18 years between 1775 and 1793. In 1775, Lucie Manette travels to Paris to restore to health and safety in London her doctor father, after he has spent 18 years in the Bastille prison. I'm using here, by the way, the original illustrations that accompanied it by Hablot Brown, or Fizz, a close friend of Dickens since he had illustrated the Pickwick Papers. In London in 1780, Lucy meets Charles Darnay, accused of treason against the Crown during the American War of Independence, and saved from punishment by the ne'er-do-well look-alike Sidney Carton. Both fall in love with Lucy, but she is betrothed to Charles. But Lucy is aroused in Sidney, here looking on it with the right, emotions of tenderness and decency he had forgotten. In France, meanwhile, the heartless and hated Marquis Saint-Evremond runs over a child and is later murdered by a peasant, Jacques. This illustration is not by Fizz. The Marquis is Charles Darnay's uncle, and Charles is scathing about the contemptuous behaviour of the French aristocracy. After 3 years of rage and bloodletting after the Revolution of 1789, Charles hears that Gabelle, the manager of the family estate, has been arrested and goes to Paris to rescue him. He's imprisoned as an émigré, but released after 15 months on the pleas of Dr. Manette in 1793. Manette's former servant Defarge now produces a letter the doctor had written in the Bastille, describing the barbarities of Evremond, and Charles is sentenced to death for the family's crimes. Madame Defarge, pictured it right in the family wine shop, turns out to have been the sister of the child killed by the Marquis and seeks the arrest of Lucy and her child as well. Charles is sentenced to death. Lucy is overcome. They are saved by the intervention of the English spy, John Barsad, and his remarkable sister, Miss Pross, who kills Madame Defarge, and by Sidney Carton, who, unwilling to see his beloved Lucy and her little girl in pain, redeems his wasted life by taking the doomed man's place. Carton goes to the guillotine. Again, an illustration not by Fizz. If the opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities are among the most famous in literature, they're matched by Carton's closing epiphany.
I see the evil of this time and of the previous time, of which this is the natural birth, gradually making expiation for itself and wearing out. I see the lives for which I lay down my life, peaceful, useful, prosperous, and happy, in that England which I shall see no more. I see her with a child upon her bosom who bears my name. I see her father, aged and bent, but otherwise restored and faithful to all men in his healing office and at peace. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.
In early 1859, Dickens' magazine Household Words had closed, and the serialisation of A Tale of Two Cities was crucial to the success of his new magazine, All the Year Round, hence the importance of his signature cliffhanger endings to the chapters. The book appeared in the magazine in 31 weekly instalments from April to November 1859, then in book form. Dickens was nothing if not a shrewd publicist and businessman, and his business model was hugely lucrative. The crowds loved the serial, and the subsequent book was a runaway success. Indeed, there are common claims that it is the best-selling novel of all time, with 200 million copies sold. These are dubious figures, but there have been more than 1,300 print editions. In any case, vast numbers of people read it in serial form or had it read to them. So the numbers of individual book sales are inevitably arbitrary. All of Dickens' attributes are here: linguistic creativity, delicious choice of names, coincidence, unforgettable caricatures of individuals, capacity to play on readers' emotions, sharp social commentary, satire, and humour. Dickens has had his share of critics over the years, as allegedly prone to overblown rhetorical flourishes and stereotypes, but his prose needs to be understood in the context of his medium and his audience. That is, in A Tale of Two Cities, as in much of his writing, he was aiming to attract and maintain a broad public audience through weekly instalments. A 19th century HBO or Netflix series, if you like. Humour studs the book, as in the passage immediately after the opening.
There are a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face on the throne of France. In both countries, it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state, preserves of loaves and fishes, that things in general were settled forever.
The great Dickensian themes pervade the book, of social injustice, love both sacrificial and pure, and resurrection, as in the saving of old Manette, or Sidney Carton's prayer as he rescues a child late in the book. Most importantly, there is the central theme of redemption, most obvious in the stirring personal epiphany of Carton, who becomes an almost Christ-like figure, but in smaller details, such as Carton overcoming his excessive love of alcohol, one of Dickens' own weaknesses. What inspired the story? In dramatic terms, Dickens himself stressed the connection with The Frozen Deep, a Wilkie Collins play still in print about the tragic Franklin expedition to the Arctic in 1856, and which Dickens produced for charity in 1857. But the inspiration in terms of setting was, of course, the French Revolution. And here the key source for Dickens was Thomas Carlyle's great narrative, published in 1837. Carlyle's narrative was as grim as this photo portrait. Dickens had met Carlyle and had read his book repeatedly. He insisted that, and I quote, "Whenever any reference, however slight, is made here to the condition of the French people before or during the Revolution, it is truly made on the faith of trustworthy witnesses. It has been one of my hopes to add something to the popular and picturesque means of understanding that terrible time, though no one can hope to add anything to the philosophy of Mr. Carlyle's wonderful book." There are enticing details from Carlyle, such as that involving the wine bar keeper, Claude Cholat, at the storming of the Bastille. Cholat was indeed there and returned home to make this marvellous image of the action. Dr. Manette is based on the factual story of the prisoner Quéré Desmarais, with which Carlyle closes his account of the storming of the Bastille, using an actual letter from the prisoner in 1752, cited in one of the early histories of the Revolution. But the obsession with trials and punishment perhaps goes back to Dickens' own childhood. He remained haunted by prisons. Dickens also drew on contemporaries from the Revolution, the English agronomist Arthur Young and the French politician and novelist Sébastien Mercier. He was also informed by writers and political figures he met during his frequent visits to Paris, a far more important dimension of his life than people realise. Among these figures were Alexandre Dumas and Victor Hugo, and the earliest French historians of the Revolution, such as Jules Michelet, Alphonse de Lamartine, and Louis Blanc. Significantly, unlike Thomas Carlyle or Arthur Young, these men were all sympathetic towards the Revolution, and several of them, such as Louis Blanc, were early socialists who knew Marx and Engels when they lived in Paris in 1843. Dickens' writing reminds us of his French equivalent Balzac and his Comédie Humaine. He didn't actually meet Balzac, who was even more of a workaholic than was Dickens, but he did meet the socialist Eugène Sue, the now forgotten author of Les Mystères Paris, The Mysteries of Paris, a massively successful novel of social commentary, first published in 90 parts in a newspaper, one of the first serial novels published in France. Sue also published the equally popular Le Juif Errant, The Wandering Jew, a virulently anti-Catholic novel in which the Wandering Jew was code for the second cholera pandemic of 1832, which killed millions of people across Europe and the Americas. In France, it killed more than 3 times the number of people as COVID-19 in half of today's population. That's 6 times today's death rate. When the epidemic struck New York City, it prompted half the city's population to panic and flee to the countryside. Dickens' only other historical novel was Barnaby Rudge, written in 1841 about the Gordon riots of 1780 in London. The two books share an obsession with crowd violence. A Tale of Two Cities has always been a novel onto which readers have projected their impulses. Carton's self-sacrificing guillotine speech was used to rouse the British troops at Mafeking in the Boer War in 1899. To conservative Englanders, the novel is an attack on France and supposed French predilection for mob violence, while Marxists have, in contrast, relished its denunciations of poverty. A Tale of Two Cities has had an extraordinary impact on the way the Anglophone world has understood the French Revolution. It's also a controversial book because of what some historians, myself included, see as its jaundiced depiction of the French Revolution and revolutions generally, a reflection of the context within which it was written. So how does Dickens explain the French Revolution? How informed was he about the major causes? Certainly, he was well aware of France's involvement in the American War of Independence against Britain after 1776, which was crucial to Britain's loss of its North American colonies by 1783, but ruinous for the French treasury. When we first meet Charles Darnay in 1780, he's in court on a charge of treason for having delivered military secrets to France. Second, there are blistering passages where Dickens caricatures the hedonism and cynicism of the Catholic elite in France.
Monseigneur was about to take his chocolate. Monseigneur could swallow a great many things with ease, and by some few sullen minds supposed to be rather swallowing France. Monseigneur had one truly noble idea of general public business, which was to let everything go on in its own way. Of particular public business, Monseigneur had the other truly noble idea that it must go all his way, tend to his own power and pocket.
Dickens even shows from Carlyle an awareness of how aristocrats were flirting with the irreligious presuppositions of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, here pictured on the frontispiece of their great encyclopedia. These were the very forces which were sapping the cultural pillars of respect for traditional authority.
At Monseigneur's palace, unbelieving philosophers who were remodelling the world with words and making card towers of Babel to scale the skies with, talked with unbelieving chemists who had an eye on the transmutation of metals at this wonderful gathering accumulated by Monseigneur.
These unbelieving chemists who had an eye on the transmutation of metals was Dickens' reference to Franz Mesmer, a German doctor who transfixed the Versailles elite in the 1780s with his theory that health is the free flow of the process of life through thousands of channels in our bodies, aided by magnetism. Dickens uses mesmerism to mock the Enlightenment. Above all, however, Dickens explains the social foundations of revolution as stemming from crushing poverty, as in his depiction of the Saint-Antoine neighbourhood in the east of Paris, near the Bastille fortress.
Hunger stared down from the smokeless chimneys and started up from the filthy street that had no offal among its refuse of anything to eat. Hunger was the inscription on the baker's shelves, written in every small loaf of his scanty stock of bad bread. At the sausage shop, in every dead dog preparation that was offered for sale. Hunger rattled its dry bones among the roasting chestnuts in the turned cylinder.
So this was the combination of mass squalor and elite indifference that explained for Dickens the violence evident from the outset of the revolution. Take this description of the punitive violence meted out a week after the storming of the Bastille on Foulon de Douai, the finance minister.
Now on his knees, now on his feet, now on his back, dragged and struck at and stifled by the bunches of grass and straw that were thrust into his face by hundreds of hands. Torn, bruised, panting, bleeding, yet always entreating and beseeching for mercy. Madame Defarge let him go, as a cat might have done to a mouse, and silently and composedly looked at him while they made ready, and while he besought her. The women passionately screeching at him all the time, and the men sternly calling out to have him killed with grass in his mouth. Once he went aloft and the rope broke, and they caught him shrieking. Twice he went aloft and the rope broke, and they caught him shrieking. Then the rope was merciful and held him, and his head was soon upon a pike, with grass enough in the mouth for all of Saint-Antoine to dance at the sight of.
This is how that scene was captured by the artist Girodet. Dickens' horror of crowd violence had been accentuated by his repeated reading of Carlyle, but also by the recent massive insurrection of June 1848 in Paris, here captured by an artist, but also in an early photograph where the shutter speed doesn't permit us to see the individuals involved. Reports of the violence of the Indian Mutiny of 1857 were also current. Dickens was convinced of the likelihood of internal insurrection in Britain itself because of poverty and the casual, cruel indifference of the ruling classes. While England was one of the few countries in Europe to avoid revolution in 1848, there had been massive political demonstrations captured in this very first photograph we have of a crowd. Here's still enough to be captured by an early camera. In this context, it is worthwhile recalling Dickens' 1855 letter to the archaeologist and political radical Austen Layard. He wrote, "There is nothing in the present time at once so galling and so alarming to me as the alienation of people from their own public affairs. It is extremely like the general mind of France before the breaking out of the First Revolution, and is in danger of being turned by any one of 1,000 accidents: a bad harvest, the last straw too much of aristocratic insolence or incapacity, a defeat abroad, a mere chance at home, into such a devil of a conflagration as has never been beheld since." So while Dickens was appalled by violence and saw it as ultimately pointless, he understood it as a logical response to domination. He states this about France.
There would have been no such revolution if all laws, forms and ceremonies had not first been so monstrously abused that the suicidal vengeance of the revolution was to scatter them all to the winds, crush humanity out of shape once more under similar hammers, and it will twist itself into the same tortured forms. Sow the same seed of rapacious license and oppression over again, and it will surely yield the same fruit according to its kind.
While his view of the French Revolution is of the aristocracy reaping the whirlwind it has created, his corollary is that revolutions go wrong, personified by Madame Defarge, the allegory of the mob as monster. There's no Marxist class struggle here. Take his description of the crowd at the trial of Charles.
The lowest, cruelest and worst populace of a city, never without its quantity of low, cruel and bad, were the directing spirits of the scene. Noisily commenting, applauding, disapproving, anticipating and precipitating the result without a check. Of the women, some wore knives, some daggers, some ate and drank as they looked on, many knitted. Among these last was one with a spare piece of knitting under her arm as she worked, Defarge.
While Dickens saw revolution as the result of contemptuous elite indifference, he had no social program. The solution to social ills lay in individual redemption and moral resurgence, as in the case of Dr. Manette, Miss Pross, and above all, Sidney Carton. From the point of view of history, Dickens' tale is fatally flawed. Far closer to actuality than his images of bestially violent crowds were frequent peaceful demonstrations, petitions, banquets, and mass meetings. Only 12% of an estimated 750 mass protests in Paris after 1789 resulted in physical violence. Dickens misses all the promise and achievement of the French Revolution, which so inspired his earlier English contemporaries like Wordsworth and Wollstonecraft. He says nothing about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789, or about constitutional government and popular sovereignty. He ignores the abolition of feudalism, the end of privilege of the nobility and the Catholic Church. He says nothing about the equality of rights given to Protestants, Jews and Muslims, the abolition of slavery, or the legal and property rights introduced for women, including divorce. Despite Dickens' reliance on Carlyle, there are few actual moments from the French Revolution. In fact, only July 1789 and the months of August, September 1792, when the monarchy was overthrown and more than 1,000 prisoners were slaughtered in the September prison massacres. Is it a coincidence that he has chosen two particularly bloody moments. With the outbreak of war with Austria and Prussia in 1792, then with Britain and Spain in 1793, the revolution was threatened with invasion and destruction. This military crisis was the fundamental reason why it became more militant in the year 1793-1794, the period known as the Terror. But in fact, Dickens only refers to the war once, and even then obliquely, in one of the most powerful passages of the novel.
The Republic of Liberty, Equality, Fraternity or Death declared for victory or death against the world in arms. 300,000 men summoned to rise against the tyrants of the earth rose from all the varying soils of France, as if the dragon's teeth had been sown broadcast and had yielded fruit equally on hill and plain, on rock, in gravel and alluvial mud, under the bright sky of the south and under the clouds of the north, in fell and forest, in the vineyards and the olive grounds, and among the cropped grass and the stubble of the corn, along the fruitful banks of the broad rivers, and in the sand of the seashore.
The political subtext of the novel is all about avoiding revolution through judicious change. Here we have Dickens, the social reformer. Despite his earlier dismissal of philosophy, the values he espouses are very much those of the Enlightenment: human decency, reason, hostility to privilege and to the hierarchy of birth. Indeed, rather than exemplifying British Francophobia, Dickens' novel must be read as a liberal reaction against the conservative Tory politics which dominated after 1792 through Burke, Pitt, Wellington and others. Even though A Tale of Two Cities is often labelled, even mocked, as an example of strident English hostility to the French, Dickens' attitude to France and the French differed radically from the prevailing English stereotypes. As I said earlier, he was a frequent visitor to Paris and indeed described the French as his favourite people. But he was at pains to avoid the poorer parts of Paris on his trips, captured here by Charles Marville in these three photographs. The third of them has a man who's been there long enough to be captured at this slow shutter speed. Marville took these early photos because medieval Paris, the Paris of the Revolution, was about to disappear. In the 1850s, while Dickens was researching and writing A Tale of Two Cities, Paris was undergoing an extraordinary transformation under Louis Napoleon and his chief administrator, Baron Haussmann. Paris became a building site, with the great boulevards cutting swathes through medieval neighbourhoods for reasons of public health, imperial architectural grandeur, and to enable easier troop movements at times of popular rebellion. This is the Paris we know today, the City of Light, with one of the boulevards named after Haussmann himself. Remember Carton's final speech? I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from this abyss, and in their struggles to be truly free, in their triumphs and defeats through long years to come. Dickens was almost certainly referring to Haussmann's project, about which he had earlier enthused in his letters. France mattered greatly to Dickens, and he wrote to a French friend that, quote, I hope it is the best story I have written. But while published in 1861 in Paris as Paris et Londres, Paris and London, it was never a huge seller there, despite Dickens' popularity in Paris. Pro-revolutionaries saw it as too jaundiced about the revolution, and anti-revolutionaries hated its critique of the aristocratic old regime. So this was a book of profound importance for Dickens, and not just for financial reasons. As he wrote in his preface to the novel, quote, throughout its execution, it has had complete possession of me. I have so far verified what is done and suffered in these pages as that I have certainly done and suffered it all myself. The novel was written during the great personal crisis of Dickens' life. I mentioned earlier that the great moral issues in the novel were inspired by the play The Frozen Deep, written by Wilkie Collins. A Tale of Two Cities was critical to Dickens because he'd sunk his finances into his new magazine all the year round, and A Tale of Two Cities was the lead item. But the story also resonated personally with Dickens. In 1857, the play toured the English provinces. On tour, Dickens played the Sidney Carton-like role of Richard Wardour, who sacrificed his life to save the life of Frank Aldersley, his triumphant rival for the love of Clara Burnham. Dickens and Ellen Ternan were in the cast. He was 45 and she was 18. They fell in love while acting out in the play. The roles later developed in A Tale of Two Cities. Ellen became the model for Lucy Manette.
A young lady of not more than 17, in a riding cloak and still holding her straw travelling hat by its ribbon in her hand. As his eyes rested on a short, slight, pretty figure, a quantity of golden hair, a pair of blue eyes that met his own with an inquiring look, and a forehead with a singular capacity, remembering how young and smooth it was, of rifting and knitting itself into an expression that was not quite one of perplexity or wonder or alarm, or merely of a bright fixed attention, though it included all the four expressions.
Their relationship came to a head in 1858 when he separated from Catherine and had to make public statements to mitigate the scandal. His marriage had ended after 22 years and 10 children together. Anticipating scandal and public outrage, Dickens placed advertisements about his separation in the Times and his own magazine, Household Words, which he then closed because of the controversy. 8 of his 9 surviving children stayed with him and his sister-in-law, Georgina Hogarth, who Dickens described as his greatest friend. Only Charlie, oldest of the 10 children, stayed with Catherine, who did not see her husband again. The issue was particularly fraught for Dickens for 2 reasons. First, his celebrity and wealth were built on a public image of the man of caring social values and a father of a large family in a recently acquired estate. Public scandal would have been accentuated by the deep social ambivalence about Ellen's profession. Second, matrimonial legislation was in the news. In 1857, a new matrimonial act had established a model of marriage based on a contract rather than a sacrament. But the legislation was contentious, and Dickens sought to avoid controversy by separating rather than divorcing. So we might see the upright but rather dull Charles Darnay and the reprobate but attractive Sidney Carton as doppelgangers, one person in 2 characters, reflecting Dickens' emotional state and his obsession with salvation and resurrection. Carton is the reprobate hero, saved from personal decline by the love of a sensitive young woman, Lucy. Lucy's obviously Ellen Ternan, but is Catherine Madame Defarge. Dickens' daughter Kate said after his death that, "My father did not understand women." Dickens' relationship with women has become even more contentious today. Listen to this video clip from a British TV panel show with the Dickens enthusiast Miriam Margolis.
Before Miriam, you said that he was. I'm fascinated now that he was a wicked man. In what way was he wicked?
His daughter Kate said, after he had died, long after, "My father was a very wicked man," and the reason for that was the way that he treated his wife. And you'll have to either read Claire Tomalin's book or Michael Slater's book, or come to my show, which you can't because it's sold out.
Did he generally not like women?
No, he loved women. He loved women. But he couldn't deal with women that he didn't want to go to bed with. And after
What,
a
did he want to go
while...
to bed with his wife?
After a while, no, he didn't. Because
He can have lots of children. Didn't he have
Yes.
13 children or something?
There were 12 births in 16 years.
And didn't he... not with his wife, with lots
Yes, with his wife.
Oh, whoa.
But he spurned her after she had
bet she was
born all the
relieved.
children. No, she was heartbroken. Absolutely heartbroken.
He
It's a very...
categorised women, though, didn't he?
Yes,
Because he was
yes,
very
he
much
did.
the sort of...
But all
more-
men do. All men
Yes.
do, don't they? I mean, I don't have much to do with men, but I'm told that...
Margolis had performed a brilliant show playing 23 women from Dickens' novels at the Edinburgh Festival in 1989 and repeated it at the time of the bicentenary of Dickens' birth in 2012. Margolis referred to Claire Tomalin and her prodigious research. Tomalin is also the prize-winning author of biographies of Wollstonecraft, Shelley, Mansfield, Austen, Hardy and Pepys, and a fine autobiography. More than any other biographer, she's been able to describe Dickens' shortcomings as a family man and his often deeply unpleasant treatment of his wife and his less favoured children. In 1860, about the time Dickens began to write Great Expectations, he proceeded to make a huge bonfire of his past correspondence, including letters from fellow writers Carlyle, Thackeray and George Eliot. While we still have about 14,000 letters that he wrote, only about 250 to him have survived. Tomalin investigates how Dickens managed to keep Ellen hidden after 1860, probably living in France. She was absent from Gad's Hill, as these photographs suggest. But she was complicit in the secrecy and instructed her own friends to burn her letters. Dickens died 150 years ago on the 9th of June, 1870. Ellen outlived him by 45 years, but said nothing about him to her children from a subsequent marriage. And most biographies say nothing about her. The 10 Dickens children were all named after famous literary figures, a suffocating burden with which to begin life. Tom Keneally's recent novel, The Dickens Boy, tells the story of the youngest boy, Edward, pulled from his school aged 16 in 1868 and dispatched to a sheep station near Wilcannia in far western New South Wales. Keneally, who I suspect sees himself as an Antipodean post-colonial Charles Dickens, uses the book as a critique of Victorian Britain and its smugness about empire. Keneally's book is testimony to the enduring presence and power of the Dickens legacy in wider culture. Dickens is everywhere today, from statues and stamps to names that have become embedded in our language, from Gradgrind to Scrooge and even the epithet Dickensian. A Tale of Two Cities has been recreated in opera and often in theatre. There have been 6 television series and at least 8 full-length feature films. Most recently, it inspired Christopher Nolan's 2012 superhero Batman film, The Dark Knight Rises. The film grossed over $1 billion worldwide, making it the 7th highest grossing film of all time. Unlike A Tale of Two Cities, the film has the powerful figure of Bane as the cynical, manipulative revolutionary, calling for trials of enemies of the people. In this clip of a trial from the film, you might notice Bane on the right-hand side. Is he knitting like Madame Defarge?
It's been a mistake. Take me to Bane. What is the Bane? Where is Bane?
It's been no mistake, Mr. Stryver. You are Philip Stryver, Executive Vice President of Daggett Industries, who for years has been living off the blood and sweat of people less powerful than him.
Oh, Bane, I am one of you.
Bane has no authority here. This is merely a sentencing hearing. Now, the choice is yours. Exile or death.
exile.
Sold. One man in the cold sweat.
You follow the thick ice. You try to swim, you're dead in minutes.
Has anyone made it?
For the screenwriter Jonathan Nolan, quote, "A Tale of Two Cities was to me one of the most harrowing portraits of a relatable, recognisable civilization that completely folded to pieces with the terrors in Paris and France in that period. It's hard to imagine the things that can go so badly wrong." Whereas Dickens' novel has as its underlying social message that misery is the seedbed of crowd violence, the Nolans are telling us that revolutions are caused by cynical leaders of terrorist organisations. This is a movie for the Trump years. In the closing scene, Commissioner Jim Gordon reads Carton's final words.
I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from this abyss. I see the lives for which I lay down my life, peaceful, useful, prosperous, and happy. I see that I hold a sanctuary in their hearts and in the hearts of their descendants generations hence. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.
My final point then is how the Nolan brothers' brilliant but wildly inaccurate rereading of A Tale of Two Cities reminds us of the enduring resonance of Dickens' great novel and of the ways in which it has been read and reread for different meanings and purposes. I'm looking forward to hearing how you've read the book and whether you would describe it as great.
Well, Peter, thank you ever so much for that wonderful masterclass. You've covered so much in that hour, from war and revolution, women, love, legacy, even Batman. It was wonderful. I want to especially thank Maxine McHugh for her brilliant readings that aided the analysis so much, and encourage all those that have listened to rejoin live online at 6:30 on Tuesday, June 16th, with questions, comments and reactions to a brilliant set of arguments and observations about Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities.
De faire égorger tout Paris, de faire égorger tout Paris, mais sans coup à manquer grâce à nos canonniers. Dansons la carmagnole, vive le son, vive le son. Dansons la carmagnole, vive le son du canon.